Good morning. I already have my foundation on, so I don't look as bad as I feel. I don't feel terrible. I just feel groggy. And there's a lot going on outside, so I didn't get to go for my morning stroll around the yard in my nightgown like I usually do. I like to take my cup of coffee out and walk around the yard and play with the dog a little bit. Get my feet in the dirt before I start my day, but not today. So good morning. Here's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about therapy resistance. There are some people who say they want to do therapy, and then once they get involved in it, they want to argue every little thing, challenge every little thing. Now, I'm not saying this happens very often. I'm just mentioning it because at some level, we all do this. At some level, we all do this, where we just don't want to be wrong. So we'll ask enough questions or push enough so that the other person will tell us, well, you were partially right. You weren't completely wrong. You know what I mean? It's so funny. Humans have such a need to be right because back in caveman days, if you were wrong, it could be a life and death situation. I got a new powder and I'm going to shut my bedroom door. They're out there doing work. I'm trying a new foundation and powder, and it seemed to be a really good match, but it's not giving me a lot of color, so I may need to do something else. She just had to open the door again. Look at who's here. Hi. Let's shut that door. I can't hear myself think. My goodness. I like to open all the doors in the house in the mornings when it's this nice. And this morning, that wasn't such a great idea. Anyway, back to talking about resistance. The problem with resistance in therapy, and I'm not blaming people for having resistance. It's they're struggling with survival mode. They want to know they weren't completely wrong. That's my take, because I can see it. It's like trying so hard. It's almost like a survival mechanism. Yeah. And I believe it comes from childhood when they didn't feel seen. I mean, everybody has it to a certain extent, like I said, but I think some people have it worse than others, where they just cannot be wrong. They can't be that wrong, kind of thing. And so they really get angry. Not necessarily at you or me, but at themselves, because when they were growing up, being wrong had a very steep price to pay. Very steep. They were either physically, mentally, financially abandoned, sexually. You can't feel safe if you know that you're unseen. A child can't. They know instinctively that if their parent doesn't see them, they're replaceable, dispensable. Yeah, that's my opinion. So, in therapy, to help a client who seems to be resistant, one of the things I look at is how can I help them feel safe, right? Okay, so why am I sharing this with you? Because a lot of people won't make it into therapy. A lot of people will, however, make it into yet another relationship. And that's where, if you're in a relationship with someone who has some PTSD or has some issues with trust, that's going to be one of your biggest challenges. If you want to stay in the relationship in a more productive way, because those kind of insecure relationships can be, well, they can even be dangerous. So if you can't get someone to feel safe at some point, you know, I think it would be healthier to break up, but sometimes, not all the time, but, you know, I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. But someone or a bunch of someones are going to be very miserable if you can't get to a feeling of safety, right? You see it all the time in domestic violence cases. It's very sad and very true. If you want to do a deep dive into domestic violence, I'm telling you, you'll find out a lot of stuff. And a lot of the stuff is based on childhood injury. Believe it or not. I'm not blaming it all on the parents. I'm just saying that in the child who is now an adult, that's very often what it boils down to. I mean, I've worked with a lot of people, and a child's perception of how safe they feel is a big deal. So if you're in a relationship with somebody who's having security issues, that's why it ramps up. That's why you get that resistance with every argument, with every comment about where to turn. You know, you may not be a true right side driver or whatever it's called, but it will be perceived that way. You might be just like any normal person and say, oh, there's that right turn we wanted, and then there's a full-blown fight. I mean, that resistance, that argument, that finger pointing. So there needs to be some kind of line for you to decide what you can take. And that's up to you. I know as a therapist, even though I'm getting paid to work with somebody, I'll only take so much as well. So I guess that's why I'm talking to you, is, you know, it's easier said than done. When we have relationships with someone who's difficult, we don't always get out before we're heavily invested, right? Sometimes we get so heavily invested that it just appears the best idea is to stay put. Hunker down and stay put. But that's all right too. That's up to you. Nobody else. Don't let. So anyway, when you have resistance, sometimes if someone's not to the extreme, like we all have certain personality traits that we wouldn't normally be proud of if they were really cranked up. Like we all have some anxiety, but how does it affect us? Sometimes it's not affecting us at all. So it's not something we need to be concerned about, right? It's just not. Some of us have higher anxiety. It's not what you have, it's how does it affect you. So if you're with a person who's got some insecurities, you know, there are certain things that you can do to help them feel safer. Like maybe consider giving them the same amount of eye contact they're giving you at first, with just slight check-ins, so you can see if they're, you know, kind of watching your peripheral. That way they feel kind of safe and you start coming in together on how much you're seeing each other. That way they don't feel stared at, or, right? That can be a helpful tool. Not everybody knows how to do that. Also, be aware of saying things that make it sound like you know it all. I made that mistake once. I had a client who was being very resistant. I think he really got caught up in his, it's not very common, but it was borderline or bipolar. And I don't specialize in those personality traits. So when he got triggered, he said something like, how do you know? Or what makes you think you know everything? And I was like, oh, I've had experience with this. I know. Well, when I said I know, he went to get violent, verbally and physically intimidating. So that's when, you know, we ended the session. But if someone's being triggered, try not to make my mistake. Don't make it sound like you know everything. You could say something like, and this is what I do now, in my experience, this is what I have learned. Try not to, I know, kind of thing, right? Oh my goodness,